Thanks, Chris. So what I'm going to talk about is hegemonic stability in transitional justice. So as many of you will know, transitional justice is, in a sense, the processes that are put in place to respond to either mass violations of international humanitarian law during armed conflict or mass human rights abuse on the part of a particularly autocratic regime. And what I'm going to talk about is the criminal justice response, particularly the international criminal justice response. And I'll focus on the Special Court for Sierra Leone to start with, but then I'll look at the trajectory of international criminal justice, exactly where this whole project is going. And I'll start off by just describing what really is the current sort of doctrine in this whole international relations explanation of where international criminal justice is. And it was described by a lady called Catherine Sickink as the justice cascade. Now, she describes the emergence of the norm of prosecuting international crimes as a norm that first emerged, so what she'd call norm emergence, and that's when sort of norm entrepreneurs with convictions about change emerged to use the existing platforms, scarce as they might be, to promote a particular norm of international behaviour. And she would say that the prosecution of crimes by international justice institutions has moved to the next stage, and that's the norm cascade. So she'd say after enough states adopt a norm, international pressure without domestic pressure procures various levels of conformity. Now I say that actually no, we're now experiencing what I would call a justice contraction at the international level. And her methodological approach is in effect to look at the numeracy of prosecutions of international crimes. And my approach actually is to consider the independence of the criminal justice process, both at the international, at the regional and at the domestic level. But we're going to focus for today's purposes on these international institutions of criminal justice. So what my thesis effectively rests upon declining hegemonic stability. So of course the alignment of the international criminal justice project to the conclusion of the Cold War, and now the emergence, at least in the in terms of the global economic sphere, of competitors to the United States. So when we had a single global hegemon immediately post Cold War, we were able to have the strong emergence of international criminal justice, and that took the form of firstly the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and then in '93, and then in '94 we had the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And then we then had the creation of the International Criminal Court in 1998, and then in 2001 the Security Council passed a resolution to create the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and that was formally established under an agreement signed by both the United Nations and the government of Sierra Leone in January 2002. So I had some statistics here, but in a sense my future trajectory really rests upon sort of IMF and World Bank numbers that would have 80% of the world's wealth at the year 2000 residing in North America and Europe, and 20% residing in what we call the emerging world, or the developing world. And their data suggests that by 2050 that won't have fully reversed, but around 65% of the world's wealth will reside in the developing world, and around 35% in North America and Europe. So, for example, by 2016, China will overtake the United States, according to IMF projections, as the largest economy in the world. In 2000, the US the US constituted 28% of global GDP. From 1990 to 2000, the US and China respectively accounted for 22% and 11% of global growth. This is growth, not GDP. And from 2000 to 2006, the US will account for 18% and China 17%. And then from 2010 to 2017, the US will account for 14% and China will account for 28% of the GDP expansion. And I think that's more instructive in terms of how you engage, particularly with the governments of states suffering from armed conflict, because they're looking to where deployable capital resides. And when we look at the expansion of international criminal justice and its relation its relationship to hegemonic stability, my thesis really rests upon the fact that in order to have international criminal justice, someone has to win. So you have to have a hegemon that can, in effect, assert some form of victor's justice. And that's really the constant gripe you get, particularly from those unfortunate enough to be hauled before these courts, but also from many leading commentators. So when we look at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, it's really a question of who did they prosecute and why. And when we look at the conflict in Sierra Leone, it was really a regional conflict. So there's a war simultaneously going on in Liberia, the Ivory Coast, to some extent to the north of Sierra Leone and Guinea. And Burkina Faso also played a prominent role in financing. All actors in various states were fighting against one another using proxies. But to understand why the Special Court for Sierra Leone was set up and not a Special Court for Liberia or not a Special Court for Côte d'Ivoire, we really need to understand the conclusion to the conflict. And really there were two parties to this conflict, of course, the government on the one part and the Revolutionary United Front who invaded Sierra Leone in 1991. Now, the French had to some extent supported the Revolutionary United Front, who were really an offshoot of a rebel movement by a gentleman called Charles Taylor, who then took power in Liberia and actually won elections in 1997. And the United States was relatively ambivalent towards this region. The British, of course, had very strong relations with the government and were very firm supporters. And Libya had trained the Revolutionary United Front leadership and was financing them. But of course, that ambivalence of the United States was extremely instructive in terms of how this conflict concluded. Because in 1997, Charles Taylor won elections. In fact, his first foreign trip was to France, where they rolled out the red carpet, and he said, you know, Liberia is going to undergo economic expansion on the back of economic liberalization. France is going to lead this project. But he was also able to cement very strong relations within the Democratic Party in the United States. Jesse Jackson and the leader of the Congressional Black Caucus, Donald Payne from the 9th District of New Jersey, developed a very strong bond with Charles Taylor. And in fact, Jesse Jackson was made United States Special Envoy for Human Rights and Democracy in Africa. And he led US policy towards Liberia and Sierra Leone. And in fact, forced the president of Sierra Leone to go with him to Lome in Togo and sign a peace agreement. And of course, as the conflict came to the end of the century, in 1999, just after this peace agreement was signed, the Brits, who had an enormous amount at stake. In fact, they were financing, they had organised for the IMF to provide a loan to the Sierra Leonean government, who used that money to pay mercenaries to come in and fight on their behalf against the rebels in Sierra Leone. And when that money ran out, they continued to pay in diamond mining concessions. And these were worth around $2 billion. So the conclusion of the conflict in favour of the government of Sierra Leone was of significant strategic interest to the Brits, but of course they could not get the global hegemon to assert itself. It was relatively ambivalent in effect, Charles Taylor was winning the war against the president of Sierra Leone with the Revolutionary United Front. And what they did is that they engaged domestically in the United States. So the British ambassador to DC engaged with Senator Judd Gregg. He's a Republican senator from New Hampshire. You may recall the conclusion of the Clinton administration. The Democrats held, of course, the White House and the House of Representatives, but not the Senate. Now, Judd Gregg held the chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs Appropriations Subcommittee, and he blocked any payment on $1.7 billion the United States owed the United Nations until the US changed its policy towards Sierra Leone. And of course, the narrative I've interviewed all his staffers and the staffers of Holbrook for reasons I'll come to in a second, but their narrative is, of course, we were concerned that, you know, if the Clinton administration has this terribly unethical policy in West Africa, they're funding these guys, they're chopping off limbs and all this sort of stuff. And of course the Democrats say, well, this guy Judd Gregg, they don't care about, you know, West Africa. This is just that they just see this as a convenient instrument to try to make Bill Clinton look bad, and anything that's going to make him look bad in the run-up to the presidential elections is going to mitigate the extent to which he's able to assist Al Gore in that process. But Gregg and they said this undermines the credibility of the United States. If we are the global hegemon, we are the largest financier of the United Nations, but we're refusing to pay our bill. This hasn't happened before. The money has been pledged, and the money had gone through both the House and the Senate and been signed off by the White House, and just because of a technicality, you're able to hold it up. And he said, well, you know, I'm sorry. And so finally he had to sit down with Richard Holbrook. Richard Holbrook said, okay, we'll change our policy towards Sierra Leone, release the money. He said, well, okay, what are we going to do? He said, are we going to get rid of Charles Taylor? He said, yes. He said, how? We'll use a four-pronged approach. The first thing we'll do is prompt a UN investigation of the relationship between diamonds and armed conflict in West Africa. That will justify a war crimes court that will be set up. That war crimes court will investigate and indict Charles Taylor. That will isolate him and stigmatize him politically. And that will lend weight to economic sanctions that we will place upon Taylor. And those sanctions will constrain his capacity to fight back against the armed insurgency that we will finance by increasing military aid to Guinea, who will then support an armed insurgency into Liberia against Charles Taylor. And simultaneously, we'll also increase material and political support to domestic opposition to Charles Taylor within Liberia. And one of, or a combination of, these four instruments will bring about his departure from power. And so we come to the Special Court for Sierra Leone. In order to focus this court, particularly on Charles Taylor, it needed to be designed in a very specific way. So these courts are, in effect, all about who they prosecute and who they cannot. So the design of jurisdiction, the design of their physical dependence, and the design of their location is particularly important. So the jurisdiction of the Special Court for Sierra Leone excluded the crime of aggression. Temporally, it was limited to the second half of the conflict. The Brits had supported a coup and a military junta in the first half of the conflict, and the leader, when he departed from power, was actually residing in the UK on scholarship. So it would have been embarrassing had he had to have been hauled back to Sierra Leone before this court. The territorial restriction of jurisdiction was to the territory of Sierra Leone only. Then there was this personnel jurisdiction, and it excluded explicitly peacekeepers from the jurisdiction of the court, but they had committed crimes during the conflict. It also excluded any external military organization or private military organization that had engaged in the conflict on the basis of an agreement with the government of Sierra Leone. Now that excluded the mercenaries that President Kabar had deployed against the Revolutionary United Front, but it also excluded the enormous amount of British military support that they had provided to the civil defence forces, the government-oriented forces that were fighting against the rebels. And there was a commission of inquiry in the UK called the Legg Report, which is publicly available, which found that the British government was violating United Nations sanctions that the British government had led at the UN against any provision of military support to any party engaged in the conflict. Then there was the funding of the court. Now, unlike and this is where we get to the departure from one of the first systemic departures from the Yugoslavia and the Rwanda tribunal, is that this court, is that China and Russia started to throw their weight a little bit at the Security Council here. And they said, you've had these tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. If you want to go after this guy Taylor, you have to do it yourselves. And so whilst this is a United Nations court, it is not established under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. And what that means is that it's not a Chapter 7 entity, and so therefore it's not guaranteed funding. So the prosecutor had to go back to Washington 3 or 4 times a year to ask for further funds. It is dependent on voluntary contributions. Now, of course, when he went back to Washington and he said, well, the person I find most responsible for crimes committed by the Revolutionary United Front in Sierra Leone is Muammar Gaddafi. So he was organised and financed the whole thing. Then I find Charles Taylor, the president of Liberia, and Blaise Compaoré, the president of Burkina Faso, next responsible. And he was made aware that were he to go after either Compaoré or Gaddafi, funding to this court would stop and the whole thing would be shut down. And this was further enabled by, of course, the fact that because the United States and to a lesser degree the UK were the primary financiers of this court, they weren't just dominant in terms of the design of the jurisdiction, but they also had a far more leading role than they had at either the Yugoslav or Rwandan courts in terms of personnel appointment. So they got to appoint, most importantly, the prosecutor who decides who's going to be prosecuted and who's not. And he was taken out of the Department of Defence, and in fact told me in an interview that he in effect had a four corners idea of exactly who he was going to prosecute before setting foot in Sierra Leone. When he did get to Sierra Leone, it was a couple of months before the indictments were actually released. And then finally there was the location of the court in Sierra Leone, and that provides for greater cooperative control. Now this is one of the reasons that actually Rwanda, who happened to have a seat on the Security Council, voted against the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, because, as many of you will know, it's actually located in Arusha, Tanzania. And their concern, of course, was, well, what if they come after us for the crimes the Rwandan Patriotic Front committed when they were coming down from Uganda during the genocide? The location of the special court within Sierra Leone meant that at any point in time, the government could simply expel the personnel of the court. And in fact, the government seconded the police officers to the court that investigated the government for the abuses it committed. So the president of Sierra Leone was never, a gentleman named Tijan Kaba, was never indicted. And in fact, but they did hold up the prosecution of a field commander who had massive support within Sierra Leone as demonstrative of the impartiality of the court, because they were prosecuting both sides. Many that follow domestic politics in Sierra Leone will tell you that this gentleman also posed a political threat to the president of Sierra Leone, because there were widespread rumours that he was going to run for the leadership of their political party, and as a consequence for president. So if we look back to the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, I've already spoken a little bit to some of the clear demarcations between that tribunal and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So in terms of jurisdiction, it also did not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, unlike the Nuremberg Tribunal, its temporal jurisdiction was limited, most importantly, to 1994. Most historians and observers of the genocide in Rwanda will tell you, in effect, the genocide never stopped. It just went across the border and has been continuing in some, and depending on your point of view, some will say it's continuing to this day. Naturally, the conflict in the Eastern Congo has had many permutations, and there are so many variables I don't have time to go into them, but the genesis of this conflict can be traced back to 1993 and 94, and the instability in Rwanda and the Eastern Congo simultaneously. The funding, as I mentioned, was guaranteed, and as a consequence of the Chapter 7 establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, just checking on time, the personnel at that court were appointed by the Security Council. So there was a negotiation that took place in terms of who was going to be the prosecutor, who was going to be the registrar, who were going to be the judges. That didn't necessarily take place in relation to the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And then, of course, you also had the court being located in Arusha, Tanzania, as I mentioned. But nonetheless, it was still vulnerable to these same cooperative manipulations by the government of Rwanda. So very famously, Carla Del Ponte, who's very topical right now, of course, because of her recent statements on Syria, stating that, and many of you may know that she was part of the investigative team that looked at the use of chemical weapons amongst other abuses in Syria, and recently stated on Swiss television that all the evidence that they've been presented with suggests that it were the rebels that actually used sarin gas, and that they have not received any evidence implicating the government as yet. But she has a history of taking politically unpalatable positions in terms of these international investigations. She was formerly the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and she was removed from her post after she continued to investigate the 30,000 alleged incidents of murder on the part of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, Paul Kagame's militia that came down, that invaded from Uganda and came down and took power during 1994. And when, after Kagame had tried everything just to simply send a message, these prosecutions are not going to go forward, he wasn't providing access to information, he wasn't providing access to witnesses within Rwanda, and then he actually ceased allowing witnesses for genocide trials or anything else to go from Rwanda to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So he, in effect, brought the entire court to a standstill, and it was only then that that even in spite of this, she continued to try to forge ahead with these investigations, and so she was removed. The personnel in the prosecution at the Special Court for Sierra Leone call this the Del Ponte precedent, and they cite it when they say, how could we go after President Kaba? We see what just happened. Remember, the Special Court for Sierra Leone was set up in 2002. And Del Ponte, right around the time Del Ponte was actually removed from her post in 01-02. So this was omnipresent in the minds of anyone engaged in this, at these international criminal justice institutions. Now, if we move on to the design and establishment of the International Criminal Court, you obviously had far more players at the table. So the ICC, as some of you will know, was established by the Rome Statute in 1998. It has been, the statute has been signed and ratified by over, I think, 140 states now. And the method of triggering jurisdiction is a significant departure both from the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So there are three ways in which the ICC can assert jurisdiction over a particular situation where abuses are alleged to have occurred. And the first is where the situation occurs in a state that is party to the Rome Statute, or the abuses have occurred at the hands of nationals of a state that is party to the Rome Statute. And either that state has referred the situation, or a state that is party to the Rome Statute has referred the situation, or the prosecutor asserts jurisdiction proprio motu. However, that excludes situations where the nationals involved and or the territory on which the crimes are committed occur involving nationals or on the territory of a state that has not signed up to the Rome Statute. And in that situation, ICC jurisdiction can only occur if the Security Council refers the situation to the International Criminal Court. And so far, before the ICC, we have the majority of situations have been referred by states, but by the parties, but by states that have suffered from the abuses themselves. So you have Uganda, the first referring party, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and Ivory Coast have all referred these situations to the International Criminal Court. In each one of those situations, the International Criminal Court has indicted the adversaries of the government of the referring party and no one from the government. So we're seeing these same cooperative methods employed now by governments, by the governments of states that are referring the situation to the ICC. We have had 2 Security Council referrals, and they are Darfur, Sudan, and Libya. And in terms of, and of course the current suggestion is that the situation in Syria should be referred. And when we look at the situation in Syria, of course, the gravity of the abuses suggests that that situation is merited. But my argument is that what we're now seeing is the shifting global economic order, i.e. the diminishing extent of hegemonic stability, causing friction at the Security Council, and as a consequence, the dilution of Western capacity to actually impose these international criminal justice institutions where it advances their interests. And that is actually the position of the United States. No, we will not sign up to the ICC, but yes, we will now allow the ICC to function where it advances our interests. And so the Chinese and the Russians, in my view, have drawn a line in the sand after the Libyan situation. And they've said, well, we conceded that this was not, this was a different administration, this is the Obama administration, and so we were willing to act collaboratively with you, but if you're going to go ahead and take what we would view as an extremely elastic interpretation of a Security Council resolution that provides for force to ensure a no-fly zone, and then after destroying the Libyan Air Force, then continue to bombard Libya until there's regime change, we would say that is a distorted interpretation of that Security Council resolution. And as a consequence, we're seeing, enabled by expanded economic clout at the Security Council, Syria and Russia's obstructive positions vis-a-vis Syria. So you'll note that there's been 3 resolutions before the Security Council requesting for accountability in Syria without stating the ICC and without calling for referral even to the ICC. The sanctions in place at the moment are really just those from Western states, from the EU and North America. And I had a list of the criteria that just to make an example. Maybe I should just try turning this around. I mean, I can hardly see it, but you can see that there's all these lines on the screen. These are the number of criteria that a prosecutor can use in order to justify engaging or not engaging in a situation, or prosecuting or not prosecuting someone in a particular situation. So what this really tells you, and this is at the ICTY, and these are the interests of justice criteria. So you have the gravity criteria and you have the interests of justice criteria. The gravity is reasonably straightforward. What are the number of each of the core crimes that have occurred, and then what is the impact of those crimes? So have they deliberately targeted peacekeepers, or are they deliberately targeting the civilian population in built-up areas in order to cause terror? What is the timing? Is it around elections? These sorts of things. But the interests of justice include the practical realities in terms of access to witnesses, the feasibility of conducting effective investigations, peace processes, and with the necessary will the necessary assistance from the international community be available, including on such matters as arrest of suspects. And this really speaks to the extent to which the political calculus is in effect provided within the rules and regulations of the International Criminal Court to provide for political interference in its function. And so I've spoken to the Ugandan and the Congolese situations, and to some extent to the Libyan one. But the Sudanese situation is a particularly instructive example in my view, because it shows just the extent to which the ICC can be instrumentalized, and once its utility begins to decline, the degree of diplomatic support that it enjoys for a particular set of cases that it pursues also begins to decline. So we saw, and leading up to the provision of independence to South Sudan, enormous diplomatic support behind the issue of Darfur, behind the indictments levelled against Harun and Omar al-Bashir, the president and Minister of Defence in Sudan. But then once that key political objective had been reached, the diplomatic pressure receded significantly. So I'll just try to conclude. The core of my thesis really rests upon the centrality of case selection to the existence of these international institutions of justice, and the degree to which particular actors are able to, non-judicial actors, so state actors, are able to control that process. Now, the ICC prosecutor has been able to cherry-pick cases so far, and remember that the original position of the United States was one of enormous hostility towards the ICC. So they weren't happy about this shift away from the ad hoc tribunal model. They were happy for a shift from the ad hoc tribunal model to a model such as the Special Court for Sierra Leone, where they could filter the jurisdiction, or where these courts would be established and where they wouldn't, by through the Security Council. And in effect, no other body would be able to create these international institutions of justice, only the Security Council, and then through voluntary funding they could have even tighter control. But of course, the ICC is now viewed in effect as a fait accompli. And the United States, rather than being at the table, rather than not being at the table and being disengaged and allowing this institution to potentially affect its interests, has begun to engage now. And their view is we're now engaging with the ICC because we are content with the way it has functioned. And in my view, the prosecutorial policy, so who the original prosecutor decided to prosecute and did not, advanced the US interest and in effect provided this confidence that the United States now has in this institution. It went after the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, an adversary of one of the strongest US allies in East Africa, Museveni, the president of Uganda. It refrained from going after elements of the government in the Congo. The same thing in the Central African Republic. When the situation of Sudan was referred, they went straight for the top, unlike all these other situations where no government actors, let alone senior government actors, have been pursued. The Sudanese case demonstrates the potential utility of the ICC for the United States in advancing its interests. And the same thing in Libya. And if you look at the Libyan situation, you really see the same playbook that we saw in Sierra Leone. We first refer the case to the ICC. They indict Gaddafi. And remember that the timing of this indictment, it was in March 2011, and it was after around 250 to 260 people had been killed in Libya. The following month, a United Nations Commission of Inquiry investigating abuses in Sri Lanka came back and said, we've had tens of thousands of people killed only in the concluding phase of the conflict in Sri Lanka. And we recommend in the strongest terms that this situation be referred to the International Criminal Court, and that was ignored. So it makes omnipresent and clear the irrelevance of the gravity criteria in terms of Security Council decisions. But we also have this issue of what we call ICC complementarity, and I'm going to finish on this. And that's where a government, as long as it demonstrates that it is able and willing to prosecute crimes itself, the ICC will refrain. And what that tells us is that that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, in effect. If you engage with this court and you start a process, and what constitutes being able or willing is a bar that is so low that politicized trials and constrained and controlled trials, like we're seeing in Colombia, like we're seeing now in Uganda, and the ostensible efforts to set up a special division of the High Court there to prosecute Ugandan People's Defence Forces crimes, satisfying this threshold of complementarity. But what if we didn't have international criminal justice, and that's basically where I'll leave you. The option is, what happens if we didn't have the International Criminal Court? Is this not the best that we've got? And my argument is we're actually better off without it. My argument is that if the goal is to hold persons accountable for the most serious crimes, regardless of their office, then universal jurisdiction is a far more effective instrument to advance that objective. And I say that because, as I feel I've demonstrated in the empirical data that I've presented today, these international institutions of justice are just so constrained that really the message they send is, if you're going to commit these crimes, you'd better either win the war or ensure that you have sufficient clout at the global level to preclude your being prosecuted for these crimes. So I wouldn't say that universal jurisdiction is able to carry out these crimes, but as we've seen in Germany with the indictment of Donald Rumsfeld, and as we've seen in Switzerland with proceedings initiated against George Bush, and in both instances for torture, those proceedings have lent a significant amount of stigma to these individuals, to the extent that senior elements of the Bush administration can no longer travel to Europe. And that wields a deterrent effect, in my view, far greater than that any of these international institutions of criminal justice have in their history. And but then the next point is, to what extent could they coexist, and are they complementary? I would argue no, because the arguments that have been put forward by governments that have begun to constrain their regimes of universal jurisdiction, and I think particularly of Belgium here. In 2003, Belgium was told by the United States, either constrain your regime of universal jurisdiction, which had jurisdiction over persons that were not Belgian nationals, that had committed crimes that did not occur in Belgium, or we will remove NATO headquarters from Brussels, with all the consequences for your economy that you would no doubt anticipate. And of course, the Belgian government followed that directive, but what they cited was, actually now we don't need universal jurisdiction. We have these international institutions of criminal justice, and they are there, and they will now do this job and prosecute these crimes. But as we now know, that's a falsehood. And so my thesis is we are better off without international criminal justice, and we're better off even with the limited deterrent of simply prohibiting travel to certain places, which is what universal jurisdiction in effect achieves. But from my research in DC, I understood that as soon as Pinochet was indicted, they set up a special office in the State Department to ascertain exactly where Henry Kissinger could and could not travel. And that same office is now seized of the matters of senior elements of the Bush administration, of the former Bush administration. And I think that's as far as we've gone in terms of the prosecution of international crimes. As far as we're concerned in terms of international criminal justice, I think there's been a constraint, not a cascade. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot, Chris. That was a really fascinating talk, and admirably well without many slides behind you. Take some questions now. Yeah, Henry?
Well, thank you very much for your talk. I thought it was really, really interesting, and I really admire the sort of level of empirical depth that you've been into across all those cases. My question relates to theory. I think sort of central framework for you is hegemonic stability theory. And I just wonder how you made that fit with the point that the US wasn't actually all that keen on the ICC and the other sort of mechanisms that arrive from in the first place, and only, as you said yourself, got more engaged in it once it proved that it has a broader scope than it had initially. I mean, to me, that doesn't suggest that you want to do this theory. In fact, that suggests some kind of, well, we may not want to call it normal cascading, but something else, maybe international coalitions, something like that. I mean, you can still maintain your sort of realist framework, but still, it's a different kind of hegemonic stability, it seems to me.
Yeah. I mean, what I would suggest there is that as hegemonic stability declined, the United States lost its capacity to fully control the international criminal justice process. And so what I'd say is that they preferred the Special Court for Sierra Leone model, but they had imposed upon them, in effect, the ICC model. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're stating, well, the Special Court for Sierra Leone model came after the ICC. The ICC was established in 1998, the Special Court in 2001. And you're quite right. Apart from the ICC, its jurisdiction only begins in 2002. So the ICC was never going to have jurisdiction over the crimes that occurred during the civil conflict in Sierra Leone. So in effect, there was either going to be one of these ad hoc tribunals or nothing. And what they encountered at the, I mean, you're quite right, it's an aberration, but I don't think it's necessarily a departure from what I would say is not a statistical, but a loose qualitative correlation between the mitigation of hegemonic stability and the loss of control of the hegemon over international criminal justice. And I think the fact that the way the ICC has evolved further suggests that, because actually the smaller players now have more clout because the ICC is not, Western states are not able to, in effect, impose the justice outcomes that they desire. You know, for example, Uhuru Kenyatta, the president of Kenya, is in London right now. If that had happened 10 to 15 years ago, I would suggest that perhaps he wouldn't have been able to travel there, particularly if he wasn't viewed as advancing, Anglo-American interests. But these guys can now look to lines of credit from China. You know, if you get off the airplane and you're going into town from Jomo Kenyatta Airport, you go under this big massive thing. It says, China-Kenya partnership They're building a massive city outside Nairobi. And so it's really strengthened the hand of smaller players because they have a diversity of available patrons that they didn't necessarily have before. And that means they're now able to be more assertive about saying, well, we're just not going to cooperate. And the extent to which global hegemons at the P5 level, for example, are able to impose their will is being diluted. And so that's, I think, really the United States has come to the conclusion, well, the ICC advances our interests to a far greater extent than universal jurisdiction. And that's why I think they've thrown their lot in behind it, because I think they understand that if this institution falls over, then universal jurisdiction is going to be the alternative. And at least with the ICC, they have a regime in place that cannot prosecute US nationals. It may constrain their ability to advance their own interests compared to the Rwanda or the Yugoslav tribunals. But I don't think the ICC demonstrates a departure from that correlation between a loss of independence at the global level in terms of international justice and declining hegemonic stability. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah. Just interested in how this selective jurisdiction plays out in practice in trials, because I thought, and I haven't followed them before really, that the Revolution United Front and Charles Taylor would have cited what they would describe as war crimes by the other side, and they were just being defensive, or Milosevic might have quoted NATO planes bombing the civilian infrastructure, the TV stations and water and power and bridges and whatnot as a defence. Did that play out on the trial?
Yeah, they tried Charles Taylor's defence tried to make a case for selective prosecution, but in my view it was very incompetent. They cited the position of a diplomat, like WikiLeaks cables that were released. It was really responsive, to stuff that was released in the media, as opposed to any kind of competent or thorough investigation of what actually drove the creation of this court. In my view, they should have subpoenaed Judd Gregg and or his staffers and the staffers of Holbrook, and they would have come and said, yes, this court was set up to go after you. And yes, those same staffers were the ones that David Crane, the prosecutor of the court, went back to DC and asked for money, and they said, well, you can't go after these guys, you have to just keep going after this person. And they did prosecute both parties to the conflict in Sierra Leone. But the governments, those they prosecute on the government side were those of political expediency to the president. So the president and the vice president feared this regional commander, who had an enormous amount of clout, enormous amount of support within their political party, and they thought that he was going to usurp them. So for them, it was a massive political gain to have this guy, and they could hold it up and say, look, we've created this court and it's independent, it's prosecuting both sides. We just didn't happen to know that these guys were committing these horrible abuses, otherwise we wouldn't have been reporting them, which all the evidence suggests is false. Yeah, and on the Yugoslav side, they made that argument as well, but they did prosecute both local parties to the conflict. I guess the key contention is particularly the 1999 aerial bombardment of the former Yugoslavia, killing between 600 and 900 people, civilians. So they would say that was indiscriminate aerial bombardment and constituted a war crime. But there's never been any explanation as to why those incidents were not investigated and prosecuted. It just didn't happen. So I think that makes the case of selective prosecution to some extent for that court. And as you saw, the number of justifications that they had, the criteria for the interests of justice, criteria you could get out of it however you wanted.
More political questions on legal, very interesting talk. My point is here is that, like, in this observation, what I see is in Syria is not like, I see it more from the balance of power in the Middle East, the way Americans are intervening because of, obviously, today modern day terrorism, which is affecting the Western world, is Sunni-led terrorism, and although Arabs have been very much in alliance with America, but this like bringing down this will give a straight away edge to that kind of that section of people. So it's like more balancing the things, and maybe Iran is also one of the cases why they're not intervening. They say if they bring it down, then the entire international terrorism which is there is more led by the Wahhabi Sunni led. So that can be one of the things. Another is like when we see this Security Council, which you're talking about, and all those things. I think it needs a serious reform. It's not representing modern day world, the power centers, the emerging powers and the erstwhile great powers. It's not representing exactly. Like it came. The Security Council was made after the World War, and those who were great powers at that time, winning powers, they were there. But 3 countries, Germany. Now today is very, like it's a country which should have been there, but it's because of Hitler, Japan, because of that, and India because it subjugated its status by the British colony. It was a British colony, they could not, but now they have agreed to include it, but China is objecting, only 1 country out of 5, but it's like obviously it's the competition. Then you have Brazil. So I think it needs a serious reforms is needed there. Country like India, which has been the largest peacekeeping operations, they have contributed in the UN framework. So, but still they are not there. Then there is another, for example, responsibility to protect. The way it has been like a new doctrine to intervene has been there, and it's like it's more accommodative, more representative, and it's more democratic. The way it was framed, it's like it has included the advice of the professors and intellectuals and legal experts from various area of like Asia or Africa or Western world. So there may be that. So I just want to like chat on coming. Maybe thank you.
Well, the responsibility to protect, I think, has become extremely contentious because of its selective application. You know, people hold their hands up when, particularly in the Anglosphere, you know, they're very enthusiastic about the responsibility to protect when it comes to Darfur and Sudan. Of course, it's absolutely egregious, the crimes that, and the abuses that have occurred there. But you don't get the same narrative coming when it comes to the Congo. And in fact, we've seen the largest loss of life in any conflict since the Second World War in that country. And then they'd say, well, the responsibility to protect us to some extent was deployed in terms of justifying an intervention in Libya. But what about Yemen? And particularly at the start of the Arab Spring, you know, if you look purely at the gravity of abuses that were going on, the level of abuses in Yemen, you know, were just as high as those in Libya. Of course, Gaddafi has a habit of saying all these crazy things, calling people rats and how we'll hunt them out, and they can be interpreted, you know, with great elasticity. If you have an interest in intervening in Libya, but not so much in Yemen. In terms of the Wahhabism and I guess the Sunni Shia Arab, the Sunni Shia divide, I think, and you mentioned Iran also. It's a really instructive factor in terms of non-intervention, but also the experience of the United States. I mean, this has been an accelerant for a shift in global economic order. The trillions of dollars that they've blown in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, after Vietnam, in effect, because my background in teaching before I came back to law faculty was actually international relations in the Cold War. It was really all about, well, they learned the lessons from Vietnam, and they did a Vietnam, you know, to Russia and Afghanistan. You know, spent very little, you know, used a proxy force, draw the Russian army down there and bleed them until they fall over, their economy collapses. And now they've done it to themselves because of a particular elements within the Bush administration won the ideological battle against, you know, your George Tenants and your pals who said, well, you know, we just ramp up support to the Northern Alliance, and they come down and they actually did that in the first couple of months. They had they had the Taliban out of Kabul and down in the Pashtun areas, and that's pretty much where they are still. But you know, Rumsfeld said, give me 100% of the responsibility, you know, you can hold me 100% accountable, and then you have trillions of dollars later and all these guys coming back, either mentally or physically, either psychologically or physically unable to really contribute to the United States economy. You know, I mean, it's really destructive economically. And And I think the Obama administration is very wary of that. So further engagement, direct engagement in these conflicts, they're very wary of. But also, I mean, the response from Iran, who knows what may happen. I mean, this is a 30-year-old alliance in the Middle East. You know, one of the strongest alliances is the Syria-Iranian alliance. I mean, you can understand that the United States sniffs blood here to some extent. I mean, the extent to which regime change in Syria would isolate Hezbollah, you know, potentially providing a solution, and you know, with some encroachment in the Golan Heights, for example. But of course, how do you control these forces that you're going to be supporting? You don't. They say, oh, but we've got, you know, the CIA down on the Turkish border, and you know, they're not our weapons, but they get to decide who the weapons go to. Once the weapons go to these people and they go into a conflict, you know, you don't know where they're going from there. So your capacity to control is severely constrained. You don't know who you're really supporting. You've got all these, you know, the Al Nusra and, you know, like now overt and explicit allegiances to Al Qaeda in Iraq amongst elements of the, you know, of the anti-Assad forces. So I mean, it's I think the bigger issue is the need for political reconciliation at the highest level. I think there's been an enormous amount of distrust and discontent fostered as a consequence of NATO intervention in Libya. And I think the Russians and the Chinese really drew a line in the sand there, and they said, "Look, you know, we're not going to allow anything to go through anymore." And so I think that's really where the issue is now. And so I think, you know, what we've seen in the last sort of 48, 72 hours in terms of hope and perhaps the start of, you know, greater reconciliation between particularly the Russians and the Americans is really the start of what could be an answer to that conflict. So I don't think it's going to be solved locally. You're just going to have proxy forces, continue to engage.
Okay, that's great. I think we're going to have to leave it there, so we can just thank Chris Mahony.